So I'm John, he's Jim, and I'm going to answer the question that Tim left off with, which is I'm going to spend about 15 minutes interviewing Jim, and then he's going to spend some time interviewing me. So you get a little bit of both of it, of both of us. I want to start off by thanking Tim O'Reilly, and I want to do a shout out to Carl Malamud, who helped organize this conference and was the first and only Chief Technology Officer at the Center for American Progress, and just been an all-around great guy in this community. I started off by saying that I'm going to start off by interviewing Jim. We've kind of changed the normal pattern here of reporter interviewing former big shot from the government. I've spent a lot of my career being a lousy purveyor of public diplomacy, and Jim's been a kind of, I guess, consumer of it and trying to make some sense. Transmitter, consumer. But he's been doing tremendous work out of China. He spent 3 years there. I just spent 3 days there. So based on kind of internet equity, we're equal experts in what's going on in China these days. And I really want to get to that. I also want to note that The Atlantic has been a leader in the new media, and we stole Matt Iglesias from you all to come over to Think Progress, but they've been tremendous assets in this space. And so Jim speaks from that perspective too. But let me begin by talking about the strategy, shift a little bit from where we were with the White House and talk about what's happened with respect to where President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and her team have gone. You've seen at least an announced shift of attitude about how to use new web tools, 2.0 tools, to try to get the United States message out in front of the world. You saw the president's speech in Cairo, for example, broadcast in 4 language, text message on Facebook, etc. Very aggressive attempt to use the new tools. The secretary has a senior advisor on innovation, Alec Ross, who was part of the new media team in the campaign, who's tried to bring sort of that spirit of the campaign, I think, to the State Department. The secretary's out twittering around the world and trying to raise money for the SWAT refugees using text messaging. I want to start off by saying, do you actually see a noticeable change in the strategy being employed by this administration? I think if you ask Karen Hughes or you ask Jim Glassman, what was there? Were they on top of this? Were they trying to use the new tools to try to get an image of America and information about America out to the public? They would probably say they were trying to do it. So do you see really any difference? You were in Beijing for the first 6 months of the administration or so.
As you say, and I should say, it's a great pleasure to be here at the conference and then to be here next to John Podesta, who I've admired for a long time. We last met face-to-face in Beijing, I think in April, when you were there to try to clean up the environmental situation in China. And it's not done yet, but you still have a while to work on it. Certainly it's clear, if you think of this kind of conference, how it would have been held, say, 3 years ago, the tools being used by the administration now seem much different from before. But I'm a skeptic somewhat on how much difference is made on the receiving end. I'm speaking mainly from the Chinese perspective, although over the last 3 years I was in a lot of other parts of Asia and Europe to a degree too. And there, most of the impression, I would argue, the U.S. has is still by old media. It's still news photos of what President Obama looks like or what the candidates looked like in the campaign last year. It's still American movies, when in their pirated version, still give an impression of what the U.S. looks like. It's still TV broadcasts. I think that there are various reasons why my impression has been that the sort of Web 2.0 tools have not made that much difference yet in public diplomacy, partly language, partly censorship, and China in particular, partly other things. But my opening hypothesis is that old media still tell more of America's story internationally than new media yet do.
Well, one of the things that I think has been, we just saw Macon here, one of the things that's happened in the transition from the campaign to governing has been the inability to really carry on from the White House a conversation with the American people. There are a lot of different reasons for that, cookies and restrictions on commercial sites, etc. But most of the efforts, I think, to date in the public diplomacy sphere have been what I might characterize as point to multi-point.
Mm-hmm.
That is, our telling them what we want them to hear. Do you see any signs that there's actually a strategy or the capacity or even the possibility of actually drawing in and creating a conversation, which would really, I think, begin to utilize the power of these 2.0 tools?
That's a great possibility that I'm sure much of the brain power assembled here in this larger community is working on, and perhaps belying my roots in the old media, the nation's oldest publication, oldest magazine, although we were the first one to go on the internet. I'm struck by the difficulty, again, so far of engaging that. Let's talk from the Chinese perspective, where, well, I'll broaden out a little more. The role of the English language in the world right now is something to marvel at. When I first was living overseas 25 years ago, you had to know French to operate in much of Europe. It was useful to know German in much of Eastern Europe. Russian was a help in certain parts of the world. Chinese was a help. Now, really, whenever you see two people not speaking their native language, they're speaking English to each other. You see Poles speaking to Koreans in English and all the rest. And so that means there is an opportunity for these English language conversations in interactions that are based in the U.S. Again, I think we're still in this transition time where more of what you actually observe is point to multicast, whether it's websites, whether it's radio broadcasts, whether it's TV or the rest. So I may be a lagging indicator, but that's still what I'm seeing on the delivery end.
What do you think? Do you think that's a function of control on our side, not just control on the receipt side, but that we have a hard time giving up control to people who actually could engage in conversation with people abroad?
That probably is the case. I mean, if you think about it for a moment, if you're going to have somebody who is really going to engage the net population of China operating in Chinese, or let's say Brazil operating in Portuguese or whatever, those in control in the U.S., if you're in your old chief of staff role, you'd have to say, okay, native speaker of Chinese, I'm going to let you run this website even though I have no idea what you're saying. And that's you can tell me more whether you'd be able to take that risk. So I think there are these control and delegation jumps that people have to take. But would that be possible? Would you, if you were a chief of staff now, let somebody run a Chinese interactive site?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, partly that's my experience in running the Center for American Progress, where I have a bunch of people who utilize new media tools in all their various forms. I think the Faz Shakir, who's the editor-in-chief of Think Progress, is probably 29. All the people who work for him are younger than that. And if I tried to control everything they did, I sometimes have to apologize for it. Sometimes I have to defend it. I'm often called up to the Hill, sometimes by my friends, to find out why they said something about them that they thought was off or whatever. So I defend them. But I think the only way it would possibly work is to kind of give them room to do what they do. And I think if you're going to actually utilize the capacity of these tools to carry on, as I said, a conversation, you have to have faith and trust, I think, in people who that they can do what they need to do. But I don't think that's that uncommon in the sense that we have public service officers who stand in front of microphones all day long and say things sometimes you would regret and sometimes you wouldn't. But
and what's interesting to me is sort of a unified field theory based on what you're just talking about, which is that I spent a lot of my time doing military reporting, both 25 years ago and in the time before I went to China. One of the big theories of the new counterinsurgency doctrine, for example, is you have to entrust people at the lower level to understand the mission well enough that you're not going to have to supervise them. And of course, in modern management technique, that's the same. And in innovation at big software companies, where they let people have a little of their time to do whatever they want. So this kind of sweeping, empowering people at a local level may be the control step that the U.S. is better equipped to take than most other societies to let these kind of conversations go on.
And you've traveled the world. Do you think it would work, if you will, if you actually distributed that authority, let people closest to the ground be able to communicate for the United States? Give me just an impression of what you think how would that be received by the people who they were who they were communicating with?
Something which I think you appreciate better about the public diplomacy and the public impact of the U.S. from living outside the country is the combination of high concept and complete fragmentation, localization of the public diplomacy. That is part of the image of the U.S. is a speech the president gives, decisions a president makes, movies we put out. But a lot of it is the tens of thousands and millions of experiences that people have when traveling in the U.S., when they're exchange students here, when they try to get visas, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that people in the rest of the world are accustomed to these granular interactions with American society where they get an impression of what the U.S. is like and whether it actually acts its values, if it walks the talk, et cetera. So I think what you're proposing would be an extension of what's been an implicit part of American public diplomacy.
One of the other strategies much commented on has been the U.S. government support of Web 2.0 tools in the hands of people, often dissidents, abroad. I think perhaps the most famous example is, although not direct, was the request by somebody in the U.S. government to keep Twitter open during the wake of the Iranian election. Yeah. And I wonder whether, particularly maybe reflect on this from your Chinese experience, is that a viable strategy? Does the U.S. government have a role to play in that? Is it really more a function of the U.S. private sector, if you will, trying to open tools up, or NGOs perhaps opening tools up for people who want to communicate with each other? In societies that are constrained themselves?
Yeah, I think that is a great point, and you're asking it helps me put in focus something I've been experiencing for the last couple of years. I'm going to use the Chinese example because that's where I've been living, but also it's a very important country to the U.S., and it's the biggest test case of a successful country still very, very controlled in certain ways. And the power of the U.S., both by example with some of these government 2.0 type tools and by actual collaboration has been effective. Let me give you a couple examples. In the last 3 or 4 years, the Chinese central government has clearly authorized environmental protests, as you've probably heard and you've been there, that people can file lawsuits for pollution damages and citizens can organize. And a big part of this has been maps that people have constructed. Here's a lake, here's where the pollution readings are from the lake, and this kind of information gives people a different kind of entitlement. There have been other illustrations about university policies and mission policies and all the rest. And so I think not by government edict, but by U.S. NGO interaction and by the example of the tools the U.S. is making possible, I think that can have a big impact around the world.
Google Maps?
Google Maps, yep. Google Maps.
There's been a lot of criticism back and forth about what Google had to do really to enter the Chinese market. I don't know if you followed that while you were over there, or do you have any kind of perspective or reflections on that?
I followed it closely, and I think that we could spend hours on this. My sort of 2-sentence answer is I think that Google its policy is to obey the law in any country where it operates, and it's obeying Chinese law. You can still get broader results from Google than you can from Baidu or the other Chinese search engines, but it's a constant struggle. The other is the sheer Google Earth impression in China is unbelievable. There's an enormous airport, way bigger than Dulles, that's right in the middle of Beijing. There's no signs for it or anything. It's right outside the West 4th Ring Road. Nobody knew it was there hardly until Google Maps came around. You could say, well, there's this huge tract of land, which is all airport. And by that, it's had effects other than just saying, holy Jesus, there's an airport there, of having people know how things work in their country.
So basically a tool of empowerment.
Yes, a tool of empowerment which the U.S. government doesn't have to be involved in, but the power by tool, the power by example, the power by NGO exchange, the power by people from the rest of the world coming here and seeing things, all these tremendous together are, I think, a very powerful implicit public diplomacy.
Of course, in countries that, again, tend to be controlling both more of their information and their own populations, they probably blame the United States government no matter who's the actor in this, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a private sector company. And if the United States government gets directly involved in trying to support tools, as I said, for tools of freedom, does it have a responsibility to the citizens of those countries, to the dissidents in those countries? Before anybody thought to say keep Twitter on, did anybody have to think about the people who are twittering who are going to probably end up in jail in Iran?
This is one of the countless hard choices that you and your colleagues were making in government and are making now. And I think to the greatest extent, this can be a non-U.S. government effort, an effort saying we're for general openness. We're not saying the U.S. government is trying to tell you how to run this election, but I think the more the U.S. can say consistently around the world, we think people should freely communicate. Anything that helps them communicate, we're in favor of, and we're not trying to meddle particularly, but we're just trying to keep things open.
Tools to watch the ballot boxes in Afghanistan, maybe?
or Florida, who knows?
Or Florida, who knows? I just let me ask you one more question, and then we'll turn the tables, which is... when I was over there, we met with Jack Ma, who started Alibaba, and we asked him the question of did the Chinese customers object to the surveillance, to the blocking of pornography, of political dissident information, etc. And he said that he noticed no customer objection until this controversy about the factory-installed spyware came up, in which finally consumers in China were pushing back on through him and on him. And again, you were in China for 3 years. What's your sense of both the Chinese government strategy and the Chinese people's acceptance of the government strategy with respect to control of the internet and control of information flow on the internet?
I guess I'd summarize this in 3 terse points. One is that today's China is controlled, but it's not the way most Americans would think of it if they're not there. If they think of it like the Soviet Union, like China 25 years ago, it's not like that. There's sort of targeted control on some people, and the rest is kind of a big chaos. So number one is the control is partial. Number two, my wife was for a number of years the head in China of the Pew Internet Project, so she was looking at these censorship issues, and there's so much more information available to Chinese people now than ever before in their history. They tend to pay more attention to what's there than what's not there. But number three, there is sort of increasing pushback when there are these spyware requirements and other things. So I think it's a frontier where more and more people in China say, why can't we do X, Y, and Z?
That's good.
So thank you for your excellent questions. Let me ask you some questions now, since you happen to
Pass
be here.
Pass the baton.
I'm going to turn the focus for a moment to our own nation, to events within the U.S., public diplomacy. We've been talking internationally. Let's think about the way you form a policy conversation within the United States. 15 years ago, you were part of the effort within the Clinton administration to get a health care bill passed. You're observing the same thing happen now. Communications tools are entirely different now from then, but the process seems basically the same. Is there any way in which today's communication tools have made for a better discussion than 15 years ago, 16 years ago?
Well, I was thinking that the point of commonality is in the 1.0 world, where when you brought a gun to the town meeting, you were sort of communicating something, I guess. But I think that if you look back at 93 and you look what happened now, largely the Clinton healthcare effort was defeated with what you might think of as old media, advertising, Harry and Louise, a lot of money being spent by traditional special interest organizations trying to shape public opinion and thereby shape congressional votes. That's really not what happened this time around. I think most of what I view as distortions and misinformation were really bred and spread on the internet. They were spread by organizational actors, but not through basically paid media. If you look at the balance in paid media, there's probably much more on the air in support of reform in general, and most of the ideas that President Obama will probably talk about tonight specifically. And yet the death panels, the other kind of elements really were spread, and they were spread like wildfire, particularly in late July and early August, using internet tools. Having said that, I think on the opposite side, there's also much more capacity and ability to get real information about what the real stakes are. So I think you probably have both a more informed public that's in the center, more questions to be sure, more confusion maybe as a result, but you have the capacity to stoke a virulent opposition that's really been, I think, empowered by new media tools. And I would, having been on the other side of that during protesting some of the policies in the Bush administration, I think that goes both directions. So it's not a tool of the right or of the left, but it's the capacity to put a lot of information out really fast. And when there's a lie, it's hard to catch up with the lie. It goes around the world very fast.
So presuming nothing about how this year's health debate will turn out in the long run, and also taking what you say about how the actual texture of it is different from the way it was in the early Clinton years, we all at this gathering assume the tools of Government 2.0 are going to make public life better. Is it possible that all the tools for making a decision, as we see it in the healthcare debate, simply make us a more parochialized, niche-ized, fractionated public with even less room for public discourse than before?
It may be, we're going back to the founding, in which you have the structure of the media is really intensely partisan, and therefore the dialogue is intensely personal. And I think that's that began probably in the 90s, and I think it's probably accelerated during Bush's era, and it's certainly, I think, accelerated during Obama's time. The interesting thing is during the campaign, I think that the Obama structure was quite good at anticipating and pushing that back, reacting to it, adjusting to it. Maybe they were ahead. Certainly, maybe it was just the difference between a campaign run by Barack Obama and a campaign run by John McCain. But I think what surprised people was the slow to react, to some extent on the White House side, to some extent by the White House's allies. The idea of getting up the website, which became controversial, about sending in questions that you think are posing misinformation, took till early August, I think, when the information was being pumped out and pumped around the internet, obviously before that. Now, that was met with yet a counter charge, which was a new charge, which was that Obama was keeping an enemies list, and Macon was in charge of collecting names and Social Security numbers on everybody who was going to be taken away to camps. And there's another new charge that Obama's got a whole plan under cybersecurity to take over the internet, control your bodily fluids and whatever. So watch out there.
And just to follow this a little bit more of public diplomacy and the way that information tools affect the way we govern ourselves. I was in China, of course, during the campaign last year, and China was slower than the rest of the world to embrace the Obama movement, I think for racial reasons and other reasons, but certainly after he was elected, there was a sense of this was a renewal in the United States of finding some common ground of people coming together. And I think the impression in much of the world now, much of that has just evaporated, that there is the same old polarized sense in the United States that people are familiar with seeing in the last decade. Again, we think that these info tools should allow us to think better, to deliberate better. Is that just a mirage? Is it going to be the same old just trench warfare forever and ever, regardless of what info tools we have?
Yes.
Okay, well, next question. That's useful to know.
I don't know. I listen to Beth. Maybe all those tools of deliberation will, in fact, really, in the end of the day, kind of help shape public policy. But I suspect we're just in a period where there's a very deep divide philosophically between the right and what I would describe as the center left. And I think we're in for an intense period of this debate and really fighting about the direction of the country. I think if Obama is successful at the policy level, maybe that'll change and break down, because I think you saw that in the UK. And we're a little bit over time, but I'll close with that. I think the original reaction to the Labour Party victory under Tony Blair was a Conservative Party that went hard to the right, dug in. Went on the personal attack, and that marginalized, I think, the party, and it was David Cameron who got the kind of modern world, the tools of the internet, the capacity to communicate in a different way, moved his party back to the center. So it may this may be, I think, a function of whether Obama is both substantively and politically successful, how the conservative movement kind of reacts to him.
And since we are out of time, I won't ask you my last question about what was interesting in North Korea. We can talk about that off stage.
No internet. my T-Mobile BlackBerry service definitely did not work there.
Great. Well, with that, thank you very much, John. Thank you. Thank you.